All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. Welcome from the Faculty of Federal Advocates to our CLE program, Leaning In, ensuring we are all at the table, inspired by the book Lean In, Women, Work, and the Will to Lead by Sheryl Sandberg, Chief Operating Officer of Facebook. This book is about overcoming internal and external barriers to success, and as we all know, today we face a very big external barrier, this monumental flood event in Colorado. Our thoughts are with everybody being affected by it. The Faculty of Federal Advocates, a sponsor of this program, is an organization of attorneys who are dedicated to improving the quality of practice in the United States District Court for the District of Colorado. I'm Marilyn Chappell. I'm a board member of the FFA. Normally, our CLE programs are at the federal courthouse, but today we are at the Colorado Supreme Court courthouse, and we would like to acknowledge graciously the hospitality of the state judicial hosts who have made this possible to be here. And those include Christopher Ryan, the chief of the Colorado Supreme Court and Court of Appeals, and Lynn Kubiak with the State Judicial Department. We would also like to thank Tom and Chris, who are making the broadcast of this program available and possible. And we would like to welcome those who are attending this program by broadcast at the U.S. District Court in Denver for the FFA Trial Advocacy Program, and also those at the federal courthouse in Durango. This program is inspired by this book, by Sheryl Sandberg. As you can see, this is Exhibit A. It is not a thick book. It is a quick read and a very thought-provoking one. So if you've not yet actually read the book, we highly recommend it. We have a very distinguished panel here, and I would like to briefly introduce them. We have the Honorable Marcia S. Krieger in the middle, Chief Judge of the U.S. District Court for the District of Colorado. This program was her idea. Judge Krieger has been Chief Judge since the beginning of this year. She was appointed to the U.S. District Court in 2002. Before then, she served on the U.S. Bankruptcy Court for the District of Colorado. When she was appointed to that court in 1994, she was the second woman appointed and the youngest judge ever appointed. Judge Krieger has served on the 10th Circuit Bankruptcy Appellate Panel, periodically sits by designation with the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals, taught at the University of Colorado School of Law from 1999 through 2001. She co-founded Colorado's Our Courts Civic Education Program. Before being appointed to the bench, Judge Krieger was in private practice, specializing in commercial litigation and bankruptcy. She attended the Lewis and Clark College, the Ludwig Maximilian Planck Institute in Munich, Germany, and the University of Colorado School of Law. She and her husband have 5 adult children. We also have U.S. Representative Diana DeGette, who is serving her 9th term in Congress as a representative for the 1st District of Colorado. She is, among other roles, a member of the Committee on Energy and Commerce, which has jurisdiction over issues including healthcare, trade, business, technology, food safety, and consumer protection. She has been instrumental in legislation involving the Children's Health Insurance Program, food safety, consumer product safety, and stem cell research. She was promoted to leadership in the House in 2005 as Chief Deputy Whip. Before her election to Congress, she served 2 terms in the Colorado House of Representatives and was Assistant Minority Leader from 1993 through 95. Representative DeGette graduated from Colorado College and from the New York University School of Law. She also graduated from Denver's South High School, and so did I. And one of us was 2 years ahead of the other. I'm not saying who is whom. But I can tell you that those of us who knew Congresswoman DeGette in high school are not at all surprised that she is where she is today. She has 2 daughters and a dog named Charlie, and she is married to attorney Lena Lipinski. And we also have Dee Rico Munn, who is superintendent of the Aurora Public Schools, which are not in session today because of our flood. He has served as superintendent, so we don't need to give you an absent excuse note.
I can write my own slip,
Oh,
actually.
okay.
So.
Superintendent Munn has served in that position since July of 2013. Before then, he practiced commercial litigation with a national law firm for a number of years. He served as executive director of the Colorado Department of Higher Education and as executive director of the Colorado Department of Regulatory Agencies. He was an elected member of the Colorado State Board of Education and has served on the boards of a number of nonprofit organizations. Superintendent Munn graduated from Midland Lutheran College in Fremont, Nebraska, and the University of Denver Sturm College of Law, and he and his wife have 2 children. So now we would like to have each of our 3 panelists give some introductory comments, and then we will have questions to them after that. Chief Judge Krieger?
Thank you. Thank you, Marilyn. Thank you to the federal faculty. Thank you to the Supreme Court. Thank you to my colleagues up here. And if you're wondering why we have sort of a vacant chair over here behind me over my right shoulder, it's because the Chief Justice is taller than I am. And when I sat down in this chair, my feet didn't touch the floor. So I wasn't used to such elevated status. I decided I needed to have a more grounded chair. I truly am pleased to be here today. This was an idea that came up last spring, and I will take the blame, if there be blame, for suggesting that we have a lean-in conference. Truly, this is a lean-in moment as far as I'm concerned, and I want to define what I mean by that just briefly. I was asked last spring to speak on the book Lean In, and I foolishly agreed to do so. I was afraid to read the book, and partially because I had read all of the critiques that I could find about the book, and I was afraid that if I read it, I would begin a cycle of self-criticism. Oh, I should have done this. I could have done this differently. Why didn't I see that? Why didn't I do that? And I was relieved when I read the book to find out that my own experiences were exactly the same as what were recited in the book. It was reassuring to find out that what I had experienced, both things I didn't like and mistakes I made, and high points and low points, were pretty uniform, common among other women. And what that led me to think about were several things. First of all, my generation didn't do a very good job in talking about our experiences. We assume that the civil rightists in the 60s and the feminists in the 60s and the 70s pretty much addressed the issue. And all we had to do was take advantage of the opportunities that were presented and work hard. And so we did. And the last thing we did was to say to ourselves, we're not going to complain about things that may have happened, because we want to just charge forward and change will occur over time. But we were wrong. By not talking about our experiences, we left several generations of folks without the knowledge of what actually happens and what happened to us, and what to expect, and what we can change, and where we are, and the difference between where we are and where we want to be. The second thing that I realized in reading the book was we're not just talking about men and women. We're talking about outsiders and insiders. And we all know that that characterization starts when we're children. Insiders are the cool people. Outsiders are the not so cool people. And they may be not so cool because they're geeks, or they're girls, or they speak with an accent, or they have a different color skin, or they have a disability. In fact, I'm going to stop right there for just a moment. Any of you who listened to NPR last night and heard the story about the children's book Wonder and the reaction to a profoundly disabled child, what happens is we now know in neuroscience that our brains filter unconsciously, first on the basis of whether what the person we see is similar or dissimilar. And if the person is dissimilar, we're a little more wary. We don't trust. We're cautious. We're not sure. And if the person is similar, we recognize the similarity and feel comfortable, trusting, inclusive. So anything that registers as similar or dissimilar colors our initial reaction to another person. And so perhaps it is the amygdala in our brain, or as my daughter calls it, our lizard brain, that causes us to separate people who are not like us from people who are like us. And that is the core of being an insider or an outsider. The third thing that I realized is that this book spoke to me at a very profound level because I had, with my husband, tried to teach our children that any decision based on fear was fundamentally flawed. And I had never read about that until I picked up this book, and this is what Sheryl Sandberg has to say. Fear is at the root of so many of the barriers women face, and we could insert there outsiders. Fear of not being liked, fear of making the wrong choice, fear of drawing negative attention, fear of overreaching, fear of being judged, fear of failure, and the holy trinity of fear, the fear of being a bad mother, wife, or daughter. She goes on to say that one of the posters she likes the most in her office is the one that says, "What would you do if you were not afraid?" That's why she wrote the book. That's why we're here today. What would you do if you were not afraid is a lean-in moment. Thank you for joining in this lean-in moment. Diana.
Thank you, Judge Krieger. I wanted to take this book sort of to a personal level and talk about what it meant to me. I received a copy of Lean In right after it was published, so I didn't have any time to become fearful of reading it. I just read it. And I agree, it's a quick read. I read it on the airplane. And I think everybody here, if you haven't read it, you should read it. As I read it, it felt very personal to me because I could, even though Sheryl Sandberg is in business, I could see reflections of myself as a young woman and then as I grew in my career. And having lived my life in the early 1980s as a litigator here in Colorado, and then a legislator in the Colorado State House, and now as a member of Congress, as I read Lean In, I pretty much agreed with every single thing. Every page I was nodding my head saying, well, I agree with that. And in fact, I wanted to introduce my husband, Lino, who's here. Most of you know Lino. And I'm going to talk, you'll really be happy about this. I'm going to talk about you in a minute. But he's also the chairman of the Faculty of Federal Advocates. So he works a lot with Judge Krieger and Marilyn and everybody else. I was thinking as I was preparing for today about all the moments in my life that really mirror some of the ones that Sheryl Sandberg talks about in her book. When I was in high school, Marilyn can attest to this, I was on the debate team, and I then became the captain of the debate team, despite the fact there were very few women debaters at that time. And debate was really a male-dominated area. And we used to get judging sheets from the judges with comments about the things I was wearing and so on, even when I was in high school. And then, of course, when I went to law school and decided to become a litigator, at that time in Denver, there were very few women litigators in Denver. I had the opportunity to try the very last case in the Denver Superior Court that was ever tried. And every day of the trial, the judge was a man, and the defendant was a man, and his lawyer was a man, and my client, the plaintiff, was a woman, and I was a woman, of course. And every day the judge would walk into the courtroom and say, "Gentlemen, please rise." And everyone would start laughing, but he never did understand why everybody was snickering. When I then decided to run for the legislature in 1992. Thanks, Lino. When I decided to run for the legislature in 1992, I was running for a seat of a fellow who had been in the legislature for many decades, and of course was much older than I was. I had been his campaign treasurer the last 2 cycles, and when I decided to run, there was another gentleman much older than I was who also decided he wanted to run for this seat, not because he actually wanted to serve in the legislature, but because he wanted to use it as a stepping stone to run for statewide office. And I was just so committed to running for this seat that I got on the 16th Street shuttle. I went down to his office in a very high and fancy office in Denver, and I talked him out of running. I was a 35-year-old woman, and so I ran for the legislature, and I was elected. And then several years later, the iconic Pat Schroeder, who had been in Congress, of course, for 24 years, announced her retirement, and immediately Lino called me up and he said, "You've got to run for Congress," something I had not really been thinking about in any kind of concrete terms because, number one, Pat was only 54 years old and she was wonderful, and number two, I had 2 children, ages 2 and 6. And yet Lino said, and he was right, if you don't take this opportunity right now, you will never have this opportunity again. And so I ran for Congress, I was elected, and of course I've been there ever since, and now my kids are almost 24 and almost 20, so they've grown up in this job. And finally, when I got to Congress, I decided that I would get a slot on the most powerful committee in the House Energy and Commerce Committee. This is a committee that no freshman is ever appointed to, but that didn't dissuade me for one moment. I went walking right up to John Dingell, who is the dean of the House. He's the senior member of the House. To this day, he has been in Congress longer than I've been alive. And I said, I pulled all of my courage together, and I said, "Mr. Dingell, I'd like to be appointed to your committee." And he said, "Well, tell me about yourself." So I sort of started with the lawyer thing and the legislature. At some point he said, "That's enough." And he turned and walked off. And I thought, well, okay. And the next week I was appointed to the Energy and Commerce Committee. I'm the last freshman to ever have been appointed to that committee on the Democratic side of the aisle. I still don't know what it was I said. If I could think of that, I'd let you know. But But the themes of all of this are somebody who had the self-confidence in herself to be able to say, this is my goal, this is what I want to do, and I'm going to lean in and do it. And this is why Sheryl Sandberg's book appealed to me so much. I just want to say a few things about the book. There's been a lot of controversy, as you've read, around Sheryl Sandberg's assertions in the book. Many people have said, and rightly so, that organizations need to take more of an affirmative effort to help families and women find a place. And many have said that you can't deny inherent sexism or racism, some kind of bias against something that's not the usual. That does exist, and we need to fight against that. And Sheryl acknowledges that. But what she also says is we have to take a responsibility for ourselves to, as she says, to sit at the table. For those of you who've read the book, you remember one of her first chapters talks about a bunch of women walk into a room, and the men all immediately find seats around the table. The women very humbly go sit around the periphery. And we need to start thinking in ways that assert our power, that assert our ability, because other people aren't going to necessarily do that for us. And so, and that's the other thing she talks about. Younger women in particular, they need to not hold back. I see this so often. She talks about it with business, where someone says, I want to start a family, and I don't think I can take this promotion because of that. Or in politics, younger women say, I would run for that office, but I think there's a man who's more highly qualified than I am. I see this all the time. And in fact, the women who I see who want to run for office are equally or more qualified than the men that they're competing against. Women can't be afraid to do what I did, try to talk someone out of running, and if they won't be talked out of it, just run against them and beat them. That's what we have to do. And as long as we're unwilling to do that, then we're not going to find that seat at the table. And so I think she makes excellent points that, as Judge Krieger says, expand out beyond gender issues, but from my perspective, really, really do hit home with gender. And so I wanted to, I was honored, you're probably in this group too, I was honored to be named one of the 25 most powerful women in Colorado, and they did a video, I'm not. No, the chief, okay, do you see what I'm saying? The chief judge of the federal court, no, forget it. I'm going to have to address that. Okay, well, anyway, I had to make a video to talk about it. I gave 3 pieces of advice in that video, and I think these are the 3 tenets that I've always lived by. First of all, do what you're passionate about. If you're passionate about becoming a judge, go figure out a way to become a judge. If you're passionate about going into politics and doing something like that, go do it. Just make that happen. Don't hold back. The second thing is, and this is critical, maybe this is the first thing, find a spouse who will be supportive of what you're trying to do. Because if you don't have someone like Lino to call you up and say, I think you need to run for office, even though that means moving across the country and me changing jobs, and we have a 2 and a 6-year-old, then you're not going to be able to do that. I had a colleague when I was in the legislature, her husband said, it's okay if you're in the legislature, as long as you're home by 6 o'clock every day and you make me dinner and you have the child care for our child. And needless to say, and she was a Democrat, so not to say anything negative, but one might think that would not be on my side of the aisle. And she didn't. Her political career, unfortunately, did not last very long. And then the third thing is, and Sheryl Sandberg talks about this too, keep your family at the core. So no matter what you're doing, no matter how you're leaning in, don't abandon your family to do that. Pat Schroeder used to tell me all the time, and it's advice I live by every day, just make your family the core of what you do, and then everything else will flow from that. And she used to say, you know, I look at the congressional a congressional schedule as sort of the cruise ship agenda. The kids can pick or choose what they want to do. And there's apocryphal stories about Pat having kids' birthday parties in the members' dining room and things like that. But if you keep your family at the core, then what you have that grounding to be able to go and lean in the rest of your life. So I look forward to hearing the questions, and I'll turn it over to our colleague Rico, who will give us even more of a perspective. Thank you.
Well, I was the 26th most powerful woman, actually. I was very bitter about that cut line, but so it goes. Sitting here, I tend to remember that old song. One of these things is not like the other one. But I'm happy and I'm honored to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation and for your time. I love being with lawyers. I'm not doing that much these days, but I love lawyers and I love spending time with lawyers. I'm the son and grandson of Army sergeants, so the idea of leaning in, being aggressive is not foreign to me. It was something that was a staple of our household, and having family and parents who grew up at a time where they struggled for issues around equality. That was a particular blessing that they imparted upon me and my siblings. That attitude and that approach to life. But I think the reality is that for all of us, there are spheres where we're insiders and spheres where we're outsiders. And trying to bring a broader context to that, I think that's particularly true when you've reached a level like we have. Our professionals have law degrees and have other degrees and things like that. That there are different spheres, but those different spheres have different sizes and different levels of impact and different ways that they can be approached. Let me share two quick stories just to illustrate that. One is when I was asked to run the Department of Regulatory Agencies, and for those of you who don't know that state agency, it's insanely broad. Somebody back in 1968, I think it was, decided to put everything under the sun underneath this one umbrella and then put somebody in charge of it who could not possibly know all the things that are involved in that agency. And that was my job. And on any given day, I woke up with the understanding that there was a good chance I'd have no idea what I was doing, which is still my daily experience, but that's okay. But on this particular day, I was meeting with the heads of several banks because my position was in part to regulate the financial industry during the greatest financial meltdown in history, by the way, but our second greatest, which was fun as well. But and sitting in the room, and we were having this conversation, and suddenly at some point it occurred to me that there was a lot of tension and confusion in the room, and I realized that particularly two of the gentlemen I was talking to, because that's who they were, that it may have been the first time they ever had to answer to a relatively young African American. They had just never had that experience, and it was an incredibly awkward conversation. They just didn't know how to talk to me, and I had a lot of fun actually. But recognizing that situation and recognizing that dynamic and having the ability to recognize that is something that, as the occasional outsider, you have to have the ability to recognize those dynamics, not be blind to them, and deal with those dynamics. And you have to deal with them in a very upfront way and address those things, and then move forward. The second story is one where sometimes I think about the power of being an insider. And I think particularly the power of being an insider in certain spheres, and in my mind, the responsibility is that I help other people gain that kind of status, get into the inside. And I think of my own experience. I was, second or third year lawyer, I think. And I was just trying to get into the community and trying to learn the community and trying to, network and develop what might eventually be my book of business and my own contacts. And, that's a difficult thing to do, as you can all appreciate, I suspect, or many of you can appreciate. And someone who I had met through some other contacts had introduced me to someone who had a small nonprofit and needed some help on the board, and I said, sure, I'll get on the nonprofit. I knew nothing about the nonprofit. I knew nothing about the person. Turns out the person running the nonprofit was a gentleman by the name of Rut Bridges. And Rut, as you may or may not know him, he's a very successful, what do you call Rut? He's a geologist by trade, but he's just rich.
Influential.
Influential, that's right. And I say that because now Rut and his wife Andy are very good friends of mine. But I got to know him, and I got to spend time with him just through the working with his nonprofit. And when he was getting married, I got invited to his bachelor party. And at his bachelor party, I end up again. I'm a fourth or fifth year young lawyer. I'm at a bachelor party. Rut's a little bit older than I am, so everybody there is much older than me. I'm already kind of a little out of sorts, out of places, and so I'm sitting at a table, and they're about to start playing poker or something, and sitting at the table with me, and I don't mean to name drop as much as to illustrate the point, are a bunch of people who I don't know. I've never met before, don't even know their names, but there was one guy with a really funny name named Hickenlooper who was sitting there, right? I'm like, all right, how you doing? Nice to meet you. Another guy named Michael Bennett was sitting there. Never heard of him either. Nice to meet you, right? And kind of going around the table, there were folks whose names that you would know, that you would recognize, who at this stage in life are doing different and bigger things. Who I would not have met, would not have run into, would not have been involved in, had not somebody invited me into this circle, invited me to sit at the table. And then I had to take, some steps myself, obviously, to take advantage of that opportunity to get to know people in a real and authentic way, and not just try and glad hand and exchange business cards, but really try to develop some relationships. And so that responsibility, I feel, of being an insider in certain spheres is something that I think is important to remember when you can achieve that status in different places where you are both an insider and outsider at times. Finally, I like to think about, when I think about some of the concepts in the book and some of the concepts that we're here to talk about, what's important for me is to be as practical as I can and think about what can I offer by way of thoughts or advice. And I'm not sure where the Q&A is going to go, so let me just throw out a couple of thoughts, three specific things. One is, I think people who are traditionally on the outside of things don't do enough to know their value. They don't appreciate and really understand what their value is and utilize that. And I can talk more about that later if you're interested. Secondly is, I don't think the people who I put in that category of being on the outside do enough to recognize that reality and work a plan to change those dynamics, right? To actually have a plan and work it, and to get to a situation where you're no longer in that position. And then thirdly, I think that those of us who have been on the outside at times don't do enough to think big. Don't do enough to think bigger about how to expand that sphere, how to expand our worlds so that we change that dynamic, so that either our world is the world that people want to be inside, or that we change our dynamic to get into a different kind of sphere and a different kind of world. And I think a lot about those concepts. I think a lot about very practical ways to do those things. I'm happy to talk more about that as we move forward into the question and answer session.
Thank you all very much. Would like now to follow up on some questions and to all of you. And I think the first one you've already addressed, Superintendent Munn, to some extent, but we'll ask you to follow up on that.
Rico is fine, really.
Okay.
Yeah.
Based on the theme of Lean In, if we characterize as outsiders those who want to but do not sit at the table, who might fall into that group? Is outsider status based on demographics, other factors, or a combination? Has this changed over time? And if so, what caused it to change? Judge Greer?
I'm going to start with the observation that I made, and that is outsiders are people who are different. They're people that on that initial brain processing level we don't see as the same as ourselves. And at the far end of that extreme, it is the person who looks different than we do, who is so fundamentally different that you're taken aback. That was the story that was on NPR yesterday about the child who was so deformed that other children recoiled and were afraid of the child. But it's also a perception of differences that may not be physical. It may be accent. It may be what side of the street did you grow up on? It may be, did you come from another part of the country? It may be that you're a different sex. It may be you're a different race. I think it's anything that could be different. My law clerks remind me geeks and jocks see each other as being different. And so outsiders and insiders, in my view, can be anything that is perceived as a difference that we don't reach beyond.
And I'll just add from what both of the other speakers were saying, I think outsider status can shift in a situational way. Rico, when I was listening to you talk about this bachelor party that Rut Bridges had, and you were much younger, you were African American, but I'll bet you there wasn't one woman at that bachelor party. And so what I'm saying is, what I'm saying is that in that situation, there was at least some commonality that you had with those men at that party that I have never been invited by any of the people you mentioned, by name or not by name, to play poker with them. But yet there is probably a situation where I would go in and I would be accepted much more readily than you would be in a different situation. So I think the issue of outsider status can be really situational. And what I think, I think institutions have a duty to try, if it involves career, not as much social, but if it involves jobs and career, they have a duty to be inclusive. I would never, ever, knowing Rut Bridges probably not as well as you do, but I would never call Rut and tell him, you need to integrate your bachelor party, Rut. But I would say, that women who are interested in interfacing with folks like that need to find, they not only do they need, do the guys need to understand that there is this social network that women may be largely excluded from, but women also have to have a duty to try to find ways to interface with those men in a career setting. And sometimes that's not the easiest thing to do. I just quickly, one anecdote. I remember one day in Congress, it was when we were having a lot of late night votes and things were getting tense, and we were all sitting in committee, and my male colleagues started talking about how irritated they were with one of the congresswomen, and so on. And finally I said, hey, wait a minute, you guys, what do you think I am? I'm also a woman. They said, no, you're not. You're one of the guys. I chose to take that as a compliment. I never played poker with those guys either, but for some reason they accepted me as their peer in that moment, and they felt unthreatened. But they weren't criticizing her because she was a woman. They were just criticizing her. And somehow women have to find ways to make those interpersonal connections in a business setting.
Let me build off of that, if I might. On both the bankruptcy court and on the district court, I was the second woman judge. The first woman judge on the bankruptcy court was Patricia Clark. She's no longer with us. The first woman judge on the federal district court, you all know, was Zita Weinshank. When Zita Weinshank retired, her male colleagues, my male colleagues, commented that they were so relieved that she didn't change the culture. They were afraid that she would change the culture. And when she was appointed, that's what they talked about. Now, that had particular poignancy to me because being a second woman, I wasn't aware of that rule. And I remember Judge Mage saying to me in a private conversation, Marcia, I hope you're not trying to change the culture. To which I naively responded, damn right I am. And what I didn't realize was that even within this very small group, fear was driving both the insiders and the outsider, Judge Weinshank, who kept a very low profile in the organization of the court so as not to change the culture. So fear was driving both the inside part and the outside part. And that's why I would say anytime we're talking about insiders and outsiders, there's a fear component that drives our behavior.
I think, just to cut to the chase, I mean, I think it's about access to power and influence. That's what it means to be an insider versus an outsider. And there are some times where whatever the dynamic or demographic you have it, and sometimes where you don't, and sometimes it has a bigger impact or larger or smaller impact in our life. As an aside, I would say, just as a moment of advice, never sit at a poker table full of millionaires.
Yeah, that's why I've never played poker with them.
If invited, don't go. Yeah.
Continuing on the theme of outsiders, do you feel that the outsider status issue has changed over time? And if so, how has it changed in recent years?
I'm going to jump in on that one because when I became a lawyer, I'm older than Diana.
But not by much.
Well, I'm the oldest person sitting up here. And I have to say that when I became a lawyer, there was a rule as to what you wore. It was called dress for success. And it meant that you wore Rico's suit with a skirt. And rather than having a tie that came down, you had a little bow tie or a ribbon in your Oxford collar button-down shirt. And the permissible colors for suits were gray, black, brown, and navy blue. That's it. And your shirts were always white, or maybe you could wear a pastel color, but it had to have the button-down collar. I was hired to represent Resolution Trust Corporation, and there are some people who are not old enough to remember that, but essentially it was created to clean up the savings and loan debacle many years ago. And the counsel from DC came out here to participate in a hearing before the bankruptcy court, and she had on her dress for success suit. I went and picked her up at the hotel, and she looked at me and she says, "You're not going to wear that." And what I had on was a bright red form-fitting sheath that I thought was very professional. And she says, "You've got to wear your dress for success suit." And I said, "No." I said, "I'm going to be in a courtroom where there are going to be 50 or 60 men dressed in pinstripe suits with red power ties. And when I stand up, I want to be called on. If I wear a red dress, I can guarantee that I can better represent you in that hearing than if I was wearing my power suit." So things have changed. I wore this purposely in order to remind myself that one of the lean-in moments in my life was choosing to dress in a way to accomplish what I needed to accomplish, not to meet the expectations of what everybody else told me I should do.
Now I feel guilty for wearing a dark suit. But you know, I when I first started wearing those little bows, you couldn't get them in the store, so I actually took out my sewing machine and sewed some. Wore them. I think I still have some. I do think things like what you can wear to court have changed. I also think that it's changed that for the most part, with so many more women practicing law now, people are used to seeing women judges, they're used to seeing women lawyers. In politics, we're getting more and more women. And I think that has changed a lot just by having the numbers. Having Nancy Pelosi elected as the Democratic leader was a sea change, because suddenly, when you look at the pictures at the White House, there's a woman, and as Nancy says, in the room. She's in the room. We had a lunch the other day in Washington with the female executives of PG&E, a large power corporation in California, and the women of the Energy and Commerce Committee. And it wasn't just a photo op. These were the senior executives of this power company, and these were very powerful. I'm a subcommittee ranking member. Anna Eshoo, who was there from California, is the ranking member on the telecom subcommittee. I'm on O&I and other really key members. So that's where it's beginning to change somewhat, the outsider status. We still have a long way to go. I've been talking a lot about this recently, but our legislature, we have the highest number of women in our legislature in the entire country now, which is great. But we have no women statewide elected official in Colorado. And as the senior member of our congressional delegation, I'm also the only woman in our congressional delegation. So, we were all really happy. We have now 20 women in the Senate, but that's still, not 50%. And in the House, we still only have 17%. So we have a long way to go.
I joined the bar and started practicing law in 1996, which seems much longer when I say it out loud, but not that long ago. But still, there were about 300 or so black attorneys in the state when I joined the bar, and that's not a lot. And then you think about how many of those attorneys were practicing in law firms as I was, how many of those were practicing in national law firms as I was. That's a really, really small number. And I had the good fortune to really enjoy my firm and to stay around a long time and eventually be made partner in that law firm. And so when I became a partner in a national law firm, I was very interested in joining with some role models, right? Who could I really kind of say, help me along the way? And so I spent a good, 5 or 6 billable hours going through every national firm in the book, trying to find another black partner. It took like all day, and I finally found one. And so I called up Leslie Fields and said, "Hey, I guess I'm part of the club. Let's go have lunch." But that dynamic fortunately has changed. It's not huge numbers, but it's different. There are different numbers, and so in the words of Dr. King, the arc of justice is long, but the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. And I think there's certainly that dynamics have changed, but it's a continual process of change and developing and growing as a country, as a city, as a state.
You've all touched on this to some extent already, but do you have any more specific thoughts on how or what challenges are faced by women, minorities, and members of the GBLT community, and how all of us can face those internal and external barriers that keep us back from reaching our full potential?
I think one of the hardest things to do is to relinquish the feelings of being an outsider. Sheryl Sandberg talks about that. She talks about how even when she sat at the table she sometimes felt like she was an outsider. And I think that it gets right to what Rico said and what Diana said, which is people who start out as outsiders need to lay that down and realize they bring something very valuable to the table. When I was on the bankruptcy court, the chief judge who preceded me, Chuck Matheson, used to tell me that in his law firm, they always invited the youngest partner to sit on the management committee. And they always invited the newest associate to sit on the management committee. And the reason was because they brought new eyes. They brought a perspective to the table. And I think that's the thing to remember is that there's beauty, there's benefit, there's wisdom, there's perspective that people who are outsiders bring to the table. And if they remember that they have that value, if they feel comfortable in sharing their new eyes, then we who might already sit at the table get the benefit of that new perspective. So I think the important thing, if you feel excluded, if you feel like an outsider, is when you get an invitation to sit at the table, bring your experience, bring your perspective, because that's what we need.
I really think there's two issues that women still face, younger women in particular, and that is still this work-family balance. I mean, there's just no denying it, and there's pressures. We make pressures too in Congress to try to pass better child care laws, to try to have more money, things like that, but ultimately, and of course, there's pressures on businesses too, to have gender-neutral family leave policies. By the way, my legislative director, who's a guy, I just forced him to take 3 months of paternity leave. And at first, with his first child, he wasn't going to do it, and we made him do it. And he is eternally grateful for that. Now he had his second child, so he thought he could just, skimp by on a couple weeks, because after all, it's the second child. And I said, no, you got to do that too. So he's, but we put these pressures on employers too. But ultimately, we have to, and that goes back to the point I made about having a supportive spouse, because you really it really does have to be a joint effort in your family to figure out how you're going to have these careers and be able to balance the child care. And in my observation, it still falls to the woman in almost all these families. And, I was just reading on the airplane yesterday coming back, someone saying, it's all well and good you people talk about lean in and this, but she said she had a very demanding career, and she was driving to Target one day to buy diapers, and she had to pull over to the side of the road, and she had a breakdown, and she had to quit working and go into analysis and so on. And I really think this is a huge issue that still faces younger women. And the best advice I can give is that it really has to be a family effort towards making this happen. Lino can show you how to braid hair, for example. He can braid hair. But the second thing on this topic is that I think a barrier that younger women, and also I think probably anybody who's different, GLBT, people of color, others, is that when they get excluded from this sort of, white guys network, then they get angry, and then they're trying to push their way in. And sometimes the very best way to get in is not that way. In fact, it's never that way because they're never going to accept you. But the way to do it is through humor and finding other ways to interact and connect. That's what I've found in my career, is just by being friendly and warm and having humor, that's the best way to get people to see you as a person and to want to work with you. One of the proudest moments of my year this year has been last spring when one of my colleagues from West Virginia, a Republican from West Virginia, Wes McKinley, sought me out on the House floor. And he said, Diana, you know, I want you to do something with me. And I'm thinking, oh, good, he's got a bill he wants me to co-sponsor. And he said, I think we need to have more interaction between members of Congress in a social way. And I said, okay, what did you have in mind? He says, I want to have a congressional day at the baseball game at Nat Stadium, and I want you to be my Democratic co-chair. Well, I was absolutely astounded and thrilled because, you know, I would not be the demographic that you might think that Wes McKinley might want to have as his co-chair. We ended up with 100 members of Congress bought tickets to the game. We had 300 staff show up, and it was a great. I got to buy myself a little Washington National shirt, although I did wear my Rockies earrings. But I was impressed that he would think of me, and I think that's the kinds of relationships you need to nurture.
And I go back to, I think one of the points I made is about the importance of knowing your value. I think not enough of us who view ourselves as outsiders really take the time to do that. Because you're living your life. You're living your life, and you don't tend to think about your experiences and what value that might bring and how that might be something that you can, you know, leverage or market or whatever else. So there are two practices I've had my entire professional career, which have worked for me. So take it for what it's worth. One is every 6 months I redo my resume. I just do it. I'm not looking for a job. Because it helps me remember what I've done. It helps me think about what's the value of that thing that I've done, and to think about what that can do for me and what that can do for others, and to put it in a place where it's continually refreshed, continually something that I can look back upon and occasionally look back and say, hey, I'm kind of impressive. But you know, you're just doing things, and you forget to, you know, remember that. Then the second thing that I've always done, and it always drove my colleagues crazy if they ever found out about it, was every 2 years or so I would look for another job. Not that I wanted another job. I was happy. I was fine. But I think there is a real importance in knowing your street value. Knowing, you know, what somebody else would literally pay to have you come work for them or to work alongside them, because that gives you a different perspective on what's happening in your current career, in your current profession. Now, I wouldn't mess with people. I wouldn't go on like a whole long series of interviews or things like that. But I would really take the time to get on websites, to look at things and look at, could I do that job? What could I bring to that job? And what's the value of that? What would I bring to it? And that always helped me think about, then am I fulfilling my potential? Are people allowing me to fulfill my potential in the position that I'm in currently? And that was always something which kind of helped me keep top of mind what my value was. Because then I would get in situations with a client or a colleague or a supervisor where my thought would always be, you know, I can speak my mind, I can do what I want, because the worst thing they can do is fire me. And hey, I know there's 5 other jobs I can get because I've looked. I know what they are. I know what I can do. And that gave me a sense of freedom, I think, in kind of evaluating how I would navigate that inside and outside world.
Marilyn, I know we have some other questions that you were hoping to ask us, but I wonder if we could give the audience an opportunity to ask some questions. Could we do that?
That is certainly fine. I don't know how we would handle the microphone
Just yell.
situation.
Just yell.
And we have,
State it. What's our time frame?
so we have the one here.
Let's see if we could hear their voices. I bet we could.
People in Durango can't is the problem.
Yeah.
As a college classmate of Cheryl, not classmate, but we're at the same time. The center point of what she put forward in the beginning, and what in the initial with those that are different from us in the workplace. And period of pregnancy, the period of time afterwards is legally in some ways it is a period of disability, but just in terms of real life, it is disability. And I think often what Cheryl is seeing in those moments was women looking forward, looking at what their physical capacity was, what their family capacity was, where they lived, who's around, how much money they have to bring assistance to themselves in some way, and making a very real decision. This is what I can and cannot do. And what's often difficult as the lean-in metaphor as we move forward is that we're talking about the spirit of pushing in. I think there's an enormous amount of desire and drive to push in, not to push to the point of breaking. And so while I appreciate that she and others are cheering women, men, people of different sorts to stand up and push further when maybe they have not been, I think that maybe even more important conversation is how we deal with what is required to actually achieve the levels of influence of being on the outside and being on the inside. You don't often, I can talk enough about one of the things that Peter mentioned, which is the role that those on the outside can do, that those on the inside can do to reach out more to those on the outside. And we don't talk enough about distinguishing between who actually is an outsider, who actually isn't an insider, because that doesn't make sense at the level of those who have a great deal to offer. And the lens and guidance that we have from the ADA, from accommodation, from needing to focus on can these people meet what is core to the job, is one that I think doesn't get enough attention or thought in addressing the issue.
May I repeat briefly, because without a microphone, our folks that are viewing this through broadcast cannot hear.
Right.
And I think the basic point was that we have this situation, if somebody is pregnant, there are legal ramifications and there are real life ramifications. And how do you deal with those issues in a way that allows people to still be at the table? If that's a fair summary of the gist.
Well, I think that's where one of the areas where we haven't done a good job in my generation in talking about this. We haven't talked about how we had kids and raised kids and worked at our jobs and the self-doubt that we had that went along with that. We haven't talked about, one of my very favorite stories is of being pregnant, and my due date was on Monday, and I had a trial Friday. And we had to rearrange the courtroom because I was so big that I couldn't quite waddle around counsel table. Fortunately, my daughter waited until Monday to be born. And I found myself with a 3-month maternity leave, unpaid, because at that time, there was no compensated maternity leave in my firm. And I continued to work during maternity leave, nursed her, and was on the telephone negotiating, and I had to kind of excuse myself when I had to switch sides. They were awkward moments. They were moments where there wasn't a lot of assistance. My father was a judge, and when I had kids in daycare and I was a single mom and court ran past 5 o'clock, I called my father to go pick up my kids at daycare. Now, there weren't too many people who asked a Court of Appeals judge to go pick up folks at daycare, but I didn't think about asking for an earlier recess. I didn't think about talking to the judge about that. I just tried to make it work. I told my kids when I was a single mom supporting them that I couldn't make it to every school event and every play and every presentation, and that they would have to help me by telling me which ones were the most important ones. And that I was sure that their grandparents and their aunts and uncles would come to the other presentations, and I made sure there were people there. It was awkward. It was hard. And we didn't want to talk about it. But I think that's right. The reality is it's not an easy path, and it's in sharing how we did those kinds of things, and women are doing them now, that help other women feel encouraged in making the lean-in kinds of choices.
Yeah, I am so with you 100% there, Marcia. When I was in the legislature, I had my second baby, and it's really good. This is the best family planning you ever heard. I had Francesca between the special session in 1992 and the regular session that started in January. So we had a 6-week-old baby when the legislature started, and I got a breast pump. I called it the Bessie the Cow model because this was a while ago. It was big, and it did the whole thing. And they had to find a room for me because there were no other nursing mothers in the legislature, and I'd be in there pumping, and they put a speaker in there so I could hear, and I could hear the gavel go down. I go, oh my God, quickly pull myself together. One day I was writing down in the elevator on a Friday, holding this big black box, and there were some of the rural legislators standing there with me, and they said, what you got there? I said, oh, it's my toolkit. They said, no, really? I said, well, it's my breast pump. And they flattened themselves as if they had never seen. And I think you're right. We just did it. We never talked about it. And now, fast forward 20 years later now, a couple of things. First of all, there are many more accommodations. Places now, even in the U.S. Capitol, we have nursing rooms for nursing moms. And most employers now, at least larger employers, do have some kind of paid parental leave. But we are far away from being able to have the kinds of laws that we should have in this country. And that's one of the things a lot of us have been fighting for. And I'll just say, though, that one thing that we have come to a much better knowledge of, I think, in the last 20 years is the balances that women can have. And I would never suggest, and I don't think Marcia would ever suggest, that everybody follow the path that we followed. I think some women would rather work part-time when their children are younger. Mm-hmm. Some women really want to make that commitment to stay at home. But for women who do want to do what Sheryl Sandberg did and what we did, we have to make that work for people. And that's what we're really talking about. I guess you could say, as we were having our babies and raising our families, we were leaning in but we were also recognizing you can't go to every school thing. But what's important is that somebody be there for those kids. That if it's not you at every moment, that it's somebody else. And there's still a long way to go, but those are the balances we have to make.
I can't beat that story.
We were waiting for your
You talked about playing poker, so you have us beat.
Here's the question over here, Marilyn.
So I think I may be as old as you are. Our kids went to school together. Amazingly, West Catholic went to school together. One of the things I got out of the book was the whole Wonder Woman.
Do you want to come up here and talk through the mic?
I was a cheerleader in high school, so I think and a mom, so my voice is loud enough. But the Wonder Woman principle, if you will, and we are of an era where we were taught that we could do and be all things.
And I sometimes think we are also our own worst enemy as women who have sought to do more and be there for our children. I have 3 adult children as well. And that I'm wondering, have I taught my children from the mistakes, if you will, that I have made? Or are we the guilt and the fear or what have you in terms of not being there for all of those different things? I travel a lot for work. I have missed a lot of the mothering side of things, I suppose, although I think I have 3 wonderful adult children. But don't we, in some ways, we have to get over ourselves and our own stereotypes of what we as women or as outsiders versus insiders, and I certainly like being an insider more than I like being an outsider. But do we, in many respects, continue on those stereotypes, or how do we teach our children or our children's children to step beyond the guilt? And that it struck me when you talked about Representative, excuse me, the idea of, and now I've lost my train of thought, I apologize. You'd never know, words are my life. The ideas, again, of what are women supposed to do, men be at home, women be at home, and it's not just laws that have to give rights to a male maternity leave versus female, but it's the changing of the thought process. Stay-at-home dads, I think, still stereotypically are looked at like, what's wrong with you? Why have you chosen that as opposed to be at the workplace? And that we continue to facilitate those, so that in leaning in and in working through this process, it seems to me that we also have to start changing our thinking process and hopefully do that with our children.
I think that's a really good point, and I think that goes to what Rico says about updating your resume every 6 months. I think you should update your parenting plan every 6 months. I think you need to figure out what's important and what's less important, and then do the thing. And those are going to be different things for every family. And what's important to your family, you should do that. And, but I think if we teach the next generation, your children saw you in having a career and balancing family, they understand that that's done. And so maybe they'll be a little better at doing it than you were. Maybe, I'm hoping my kids will be better than I was. But I think the key to all of that is finding a partner who is able to share that. I'm really full of anecdotes, having fought at this front for a long time. I'll never forget one year, some years ago, we were getting ready to leave for the August recess. Congress is on recess the month of August, and I was talking to one of my male colleagues who had twin boys who were 4 years old. And I said to him, we were just chit-chatting, and I said, so what are you doing over the August recess? And he said, oh, I'm going to so-and-so's golf tournament. I'm going to so-and-so's golf tournament. I'm doing this and this. It immediately became clear to me that he wasn't really going home at all during the month of August to see his kids. And he said to me, what are you doing in August? I said, well, let's see. The family vacation starts Monday, and so I got to pack up the car, and then school starts August 15th, so we got to do, and that was where my mind was at. Well, if I had now, I think a lot of these younger men who I'm serving with in Congress, if I said to them, so what are you doing in the August recess, they would have had the same answer that I had. And that's where I think the mores have to change. Same thing. It's like, who's picking up the kid? Oh my gosh, my trial's running late. Who's picking up the kids? Well, dad or grandpa's picking up the kids. That's where the mores really have to change, so that the whole burden is not on the mother. So you're not trying to do a 2-week business trip and organize the whole thing before you go. And believe you me, I know that feeling.
One of the things about being an outsider is that we want to be perfect. everybody sitting here, Rico, Diana, I, all have a tendency to want to do a perfect job. We were probably, everybody here in the room, what they call the overachievers. The truth is, we're not perfect. We're never going to be perfect. We're not going to be perfect parents. We're not going to be perfect lawyers. We're not going to be perfect judges. We're not going to be perfect school superintendents or legislators. We only do the best we can. And there are trade-offs that go with that. And although we live in a society where we get pretty close to perfect on a lot of things, life is a process, and we learn from the mistakes we made. I would go back and redo a lot of things. I'm sure you would too. Rico, maybe a few things on your resume.
Maybe a trial I had in front of you, but
Probably if you remind me, I would have done something different too. The truth is we have to be tolerant of the fact that we are not going to be perfect. Nor is anybody else going to be perfect, and it is a work in progress. So I would say that letting go of that expectation is one of the ways we get through.
I think certainly the idea that anybody can do it all is both a fallacy and a disservice, and leads to some of the stress and issues that you mentioned in that story, Diana. But I think the reality is, particularly in your practice of law, it's a structure that values different choices than a lot of people who are on the outside are making. Values different choices than I certainly made as a young black lawyer, values different choices than some women make or choose to make. And it's the question of how do you otherwise demonstrate your value? How do you otherwise show that the value choice that structure has made, be it a firm, being a client in-house, or be it whatever else, how that value structure is not necessarily accurate, and it does not accurately assess what can be done and what you can do. And I think that's an ongoing struggle that you continually have to be mindful of. Again, I always think about how you have to be thoughtful about this, how you have to realize, I realized early on in my practice that I was never going to be the lawyer who billed 2,200 hours a year. Was not going to be me. Because I made some choices about how I spent my time working with Amnesty International or the ACLU or other community things that were very important and embedded with me. And that meant that I was not going to be that lawyer. I recognized that early on and understood that I had to do some things differently and do some other things so that the structure of that law firm would find value for me, and would reward me for that value. I had to be very purposeful about that and direct my career along a path recognizing that I would not meet that standard of value.
That's a good point.
We have just about 5 more minutes left. And what I'm going to suggest at this point is that each of the 3 of you take a few moments and do something in the way of a closing statement, and akin to a closing statement, and think about the fact that those of us who are here today and who are either in this room or watching via broadcast, we are preaching to the choir. We are familiar with Sheryl Sandberg's book, or we've read it. What about all the other people out there who have not? How do we convince them that it is important to ensure that as many people as possible are able to sit at the table?
Yeah, I want you to. Oh, okay. I'll start.
You're the judge.
I started by saying that the book really meant a lot to me because it pointed out to me some things about myself and about my values and what I thought about life. And one of the things that it pointed out is that we haven't talked about this. And that's why we're having this lean-in moment. A lean-in moment, in my view, is a risk-taking moment. It's a moment to think about something from a new perspective and not be afraid about talking about issues that are hard to talk about. In this particular case, outsiders and insiders. It makes me think about my law clerk who I invited today to wear his daughter to work. in a snuggly because she's a month old and she can't sleep laying down, and his wife is going nuts at home. It makes me think about the folks that come to court and they don't want to serve on a jury because they've got family obligations, and how I can accommodate them. It makes me think about how we all have an interest in seeing that spark of genius in somebody else, and how I have to tone down that lizard brain so that I can see the spark of genius in somebody who looks different than I do, or acts different, or believes different things than I do. So I hope that what this is the beginning of conversations that you have with other people. Lean in moments, taking risks yourself, and encouraging other people to lean in.
You know, in the last chapter of her book, Sheryl Sandberg says, it's up to us to end the self-fulfilling belief that women can't do this, women can't do that. Throwing up our hands and saying it can't be done ensures it will never be done. And then she goes on to say that there were very few women who ascended to leadership positions in the generation before ours. Gradually, more and more women ascend to leadership. And what she says, and I agree with it, is the more women attain these positions of power, be it partners at law firms, political figures, judges, women in business, then gradually it will become more and more easy for women. So the message that I would give to everybody here, and I'm not sure we are preaching to the choir, because, you know, the choir, we haven't tuned up yet. You know, every single person here has their own situation that they're living with and trying to struggle with. So what I would say is, if each person here really makes an effort to lean in their life and bring others along, then that will have achieved the goal of inclusion and bringing those outsiders in. And I think that's what we can all hope to achieve.
You know, I mentioned at the start that I really love lawyers, and I mean that. I really, love lawyers and the practice of law. I'm just not doing it right now. But I've had the opportunity over my career to be in and out of the practice of law, and all it's done is maybe love lawyers and the practice of law even more, because we have a kind of get-it-done culture, right? It doesn't matter if you sleep this week, you got to get it done. Doesn't matter what needs to happen, you got to get it done. And that's not really a universal kind of culture in different areas and different professions and different places. But I find that an interesting dichotomy against a lot of, I think, people in, we're talking about this area of feeling like an outsider, get frustrated and we get discouraged, and we don't start thinking, using that legal part of our minds about how do I get it done, right? And really thinking practical steps of, if I feel like an outsider, what do I need to do to change that dynamic? And what are the steps I need to put in place to get it done? And that's not always the case in every place. And it may be that you got to find a different place. And that may be what it means about getting it done. But I love that ethic, I love that mentality, and I think as lawyers we're trained in that, and that's something that we should continually value and figure out how to do those things and apply those things in the rest of our lives.
Great. Well, it is just now about 1:30, and I would like to thank all of you panelists for being here. And thanks to the state judicial folks who helped make this beautiful setting possible for us. And thank you all for being here.
And thank you, Marilyn, for putting this all
Absolutely.
together.
And the federal faculty.